In a London courtroom in 1895, a prosecutor stood up, opened a novel, and began reading it aloud to a jury line by line, as evidence that its author was a criminal. The book was fiction. The author was sitting a few feet away. And before the trials were over, the words he had invented would help send him to prison and destroy him. The author was Oscar Wilde. The novel was The Picture of Dorian Gray. It was the only novel he ever wrote. This is not a summary of that book. This is an argument about what Wilde was actually warning us about, and why, more than a century later, his warning reads less like Victorian melodrama and more like a description of the world you scrolled through this morning. Here is what everyone thinks they know. A beautiful young man wishes that a portrait of himself would age and decay in his place, so that he could stay young and flawless forever. The wish comes true. He stays perfect. The painting, hidden in an attic, absorbs every sin, every cruelty, every year, growing more hideous as the man stays untouched. It sounds like a horror story about vanity. A morality tale. Don't be too obsessed with your own face. But that reading misses what Wilde was really circling. Because Dorian's tragedy is not that he loves his own beauty. It's that he discovers he can be one thing in public and another thing entirely in private, and that the public version is the only one anyone will ever judge him by. Watch how it happens in the book. Dorian is corrupted not by a mirror, but by a man, Lord Henry Wotton, a glittering, poisonous aristocrat who fills his head with a single seductive idea, that the only things worth living for are youth and beauty, and that to deny yourself any pleasure is a kind of cowardice. Lord Henry never lifts a finger to harm anyone. He just talks. He hands Dorian a philosophy and then watches, amused, as the young man builds his entire life around it. And the face stays innocent. The truth gets locked in a room nobody sees. Now hold that thought. Because there's a reason Wilde understood that split so intimately, and it has everything to do with the second life he was living while he wrote it. To understand the warning, you have to understand the censorship, because the version most people read was already softened before it ever reached them. Wilde wrote Dorian Gray first as a long story for an American magazine, Lippincott's, in 1890. And the magazine's editor, before printing it, quietly cut roughly 500 words out of it. He didn't ask. He didn't tell Wilde. He just deleted the passages he found too dangerous, most of them lines that made the love between the painter, Basil Hallward, and Dorian unmistakably romantic, even erotic. Then the British press attacked it anyway. Reviewers called it poisonous, unclean, a book for outlawed noblemen and perverted telegraph boys. One paper said it was fit only to be burned. So when Wilde turned it into the 1891 book, he didn't fight back by restoring what was cut. He retreated further. He added 6 new chapters to make it look more like a respectable novel, and he wrote a now famous preface full of cool, defiant lines. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. That preface was armor. It was Wilde trying to insist, in advance, that art had nothing to do with the morals of the artist. The fully uncensored original, the one Wilde actually wrote, before the editor's knife, wasn't published until 2011. 121 years later. Think about that. For more than a century, the world's most famous version of this novel was a version that had already been edited for danger, twice over, once in secret by a nervous American editor, and once by Wilde himself, flinching from his own critics. Wilde sanded down his own book to survive. And the most chilling part is what that self-censorship foreshadowed about his own life. Because the gap between the public Wilde and the private Wilde was not a metaphor. It was real, and it was dangerous. In Victorian England, sex between men was a crime. The law was called gross indecency, passed in 1885, and it carried up to 2 years of hard labor. Wilde was a married man with 2 sons, a celebrated playwright, the most quoted wit in London. He was also, privately, in love with a young aristocrat named Lord Alfred Douglas. Douglas's father, a violent, raging man called the Marquis of Queensberry, found out and left a card at Wilde's club accusing him, in a misspelled scrawl, of posing as a sodomite. It was a public insult designed to provoke. And Wilde made the catastrophic decision to fight it. He sued Queensberry for libel. To win a libel case, you have to prove the insult was false. So Queensberry's lawyers set out to prove it was true. They hired investigators. They gathered names. And then they reached for the one piece of evidence Wilde had handed them himself years earlier in print. They reached for his novel. This is the moment the warning becomes literal. In the witness box, Wilde was cross-examined by Queensberry's barrister, Edward Carson, a man who had been Wilde's classmate at Trinity College, Dublin. And Carson did something almost unheard of. He treated a work of fiction as a confession. He read passages from Dorian Gray aloud and demanded Wilde defend them as if they were diary entries. He quoted the painter Basil saying he worshipped Dorian, that he could not be happy unless he saw him every day. "Have you ever adored a young man madly?" Carson asked. He pressed on the deleted, the suggestive, the tender. He tried to collapse the distance between what Wilde wrote and what Wilde was. Wilde fought back with wit, brilliant, quotable, doomed. When Carson sneered at one of his epigrams, Wilde corrected the lawyer's grammar. The gallery laughed. But every laugh was a step closer to the cliff, because Carson wasn't trying to win an argument. He was building a record. Each tender line from the novel, read aloud and left hanging in the air, was a brick in the case that the man who wrote such things must surely live them. The strategy was a trap. The libel case collapsed. And the evidence dragged out in that courtroom didn't just lose Wilde his lawsuit. It handed the state everything it needed. The man who sued to defend his name was about to be arrested in his own. Within hours of losing the libel trial, the authorities used the testimony against him. Wilde was arrested and charged criminally with gross indecency. There were 2 more trials. The first jury couldn't agree. The second convicted him. On the 20th of May, 1895, the judge sentenced Oscar Wilde to 2 years of hard labor and called it, with open contempt, the worst case I have ever tried. He served the full term. He broke stones, walked a treadmill, slept on a plank bed. He emerged bankrupt, his name a slur, his plays pulled from London stages. He fled to France under a false name and died there 3 years later in a cheap hotel room at 46. The book that imagined a man whose hidden self was exposed and punished had, in the end, exposed and punished its author. Wilde wrote the mechanism of his own destruction and then walked straight into it. But here's the part that should stop you. Because the thing Wilde was actually warning about wasn't a Victorian sex law. It was something that didn't fully arrive until our century. Think again about what Dorian Gray actually does. He keeps a flawless public image. He keeps the truth of who he is locked in a private place. He performs perfection for an audience that judges only the surface, and he lets the real record of his choices accumulate, unseen, in a room he never lets anyone enter. Now think about the image you maintain. The filtered photo that smooths your skin, brightens your eyes, sharpens your jaw. The curated feed where every meal is beautiful and every relationship looks effortless. The profile that is younger, thinner, happier, more successful than the person who actually wakes up in your bed. We have all built a portrait of ourselves to show the world, and we keep the real one, the aging and anxious and complicated one, hidden away. Wilde saw the exact psychology of this in 1890, before the camera was in every hand. He understood that when a culture learns to judge a person by a perfected image, the person starts living for the image, and the gap between the surface and the soul becomes the place where everything rots. Dorian's painting is the original filter. It's the unretouched file we are all terrified someone will open. Wilde wasn't warning us about vanity. He was warning us about a world that would reward us for becoming beautiful liars and then quietly destroy us in the room where the truth is kept. That is why his only novel, the one read aloud to convict him, still reads like a prophecy. If this changed how you see the picture of Dorian Gray and the image you put online every day, subscribe right now. Page and Flame breaks down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time, the readings you were never handed in school. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It's the one signal that tells the algorithm a story like this deserves to be seen. Wilde's portrait stayed hidden for too long. Don't let this one.